How many people did not want to get out of bed this morning? I think it was 14 degrees in my room. It was like, okay. Ugh. Time to move to Florida, I guess. Actually, nobody wants to live in Florida. Anyway. Amen. Okay, let's get this started. Hey guys, my name is Josh. I'm the teaching pastor here, and I want to welcome you to One Hope. Thanks for coming today. We, if you're new or you're newer to church, one of the things that at least we do as a church is we go through a teaching series. In order to kind of understand this, the best metaphor I know is it's kind of like a book. Every series is kind of like a book, and every week we go through a new chapter. And so the book or the series that we're in is called The Story, and it's a 9-month series. Basically, we started in Genesis 1:1, and we're going to end in Revelation 21:22, walking through the whole Bible, showing the story of the Bible. And the hope in doing this, the reason why we're doing it, is this. We really wanted to show how in every little story that you probably know, David and Goliath, Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, like all these little stories that you know, they're really telling the same story. They're telling the same story over and over again, and it's very simply put, it's the story of God pursuing you. God has been up to the same thing from the beginning of creation into eternity in the future. He is pursuing you. And the things that he would do in order to have you, frankly, are scandalous. A lot of religions think that Christians are dum-dums because we believe that a holy God put on flesh. That idea is so hard for other religions to believe because that's not holiness. God has to dwell in heaven. He has to stay away. But our God said, no, I'm stepping down to save you from your sins so that we can be together. That's the big idea for this series. That's my hope that you take away every week, is that you see that in maybe just a different light. And so today, we're going to be talking about a very familiar character. His name is Solomon. And actually, as I was thinking about this, by the way, hey, did you know One Hope is going to turn 3 years old in a couple weeks? February 12th. Thank you. I said it to the first service, and they're like, cool. It's because they're not awake yet. But anyway, we're turning 3 in a couple of weeks. And it's kind of funny. In the last 3 years, I think we've talked about Solomon way more than most churches have. Our third series that we ever did was called Two Become One, and it was a series in the Song of Solomon, which is a book by Solomon. It's an epic love poem that's pretty explicit, and so you should totally check that out. That series is on our YouTube channel, One Hope Toledo. It's also on our website, onehopetoledo.com. So check that out. The last series that we did was a Love No Matter What series, relationships. And the basic idea for that series was we were going to look in the Proverbs, which is another book that Solomon wrote, for wisdom on how to love each other. And so we've done 2 series based on Solomon. And we've talked a lot about his life. We've talked about his struggles. We've talked about the good things about him and the bad things about him. And I don't want to repeat myself. I talk too long anyway, So here's what we're going to do today. Solomon wrote one more book. Somebody's laughing at me. He talks too long anyway. Anyway, so someone wrote another book, and it's called Ecclesiastes. Start getting pumped up right now, please, because Ecclesiastes is really amazing. It's like K-Love. It's super positive and encouraging. So you're going to walk away being like, yes, Ecclesiastes. Let me give you the main thing, the main point that Solomon's trying to make in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's so hopeful and positive. It's basically this: just give up. Quit. You're trying too hard. Everybody knows. You're overworked. You're trying too hard. Just give up. Quit. Walk home. Go home. Take a nap or something. Like, you give up. You're trying too hard. Just give up. That's the main idea from the book of Ecclesiastes. And so we're going to do an overview, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to do 3 things, okay? We're going to see 3 things today. First, we're going to look at the central image or metaphor in Ecclesiastes. There's an image that he keeps using over and over, and if you don't understand what he's trying to say with that image, you won't understand the book. So we're going to look at that central image. Then we're going to see why you should just give up. That's going to be the fun part. Why you should just give up. And then we're going to see, this is the last thing that we're going to cover is, once you give up, here's what you should do. image, why you should give up, and once you give up, here's what you should do. We're going to pick this up in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. It goes like this: "The words of the preacher, the son of David, the king in Jerusalem." That's clearly Solomon. And he starts the whole thing in a very positive tone. He says, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. "Vanity of vanities." There's an exclamation point, so you got to yell that. "All is vanity." He actually ends it the same way. This is from 12:8. "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. "All is vanity." Let's play a game. Everybody raise your hand. Go ahead, do it. I'm making you do it. Some of you are rolling your eyes at me. Get over it. Raise your hand. Okay, if you have used the word vanity in the last week, put your hand down. Oh, yeah, some of you are like, wait, no, no. If you have used the word vanity in the last month, put your hand down. This is exactly what I thought was going to happen. Put your hand down if you know what the word vanity means. Some honest people, thank God. Here's the problem with translating the Bible. Sometimes the Hebrew word means something that we probably do have a word for in English, but sometimes it's a word that nobody uses. Vanity. We're going to see another one later, vexation. Does anybody know what vexation means? Man, you got to read Jane Austen in order to hear that word. Anyway, so here's the thing. I normally, my normal philosophy on translations is that those guys get paid to study the Hebrew language and I don't, and so they know more than me, and so I typically try to defer to them. It's like, well, you know more than me about this. But here's the thing. This genuinely is a bad translation. And I'm going to tell you why. Number one, nobody knows the word vanity. You don't use that word. It's hard for you to understand what Solomon means when he's using the word vanity. But number two, it's not actually a translation. It's an interpretation. The actual Hebrew word is the word hevel. Can we throw that on the screen behind me? Hevel. And hevel literally means vapor or mist. So you have to understand this. When Solomon is speaking, he's saying hevel. Hevel, says the preacher. Everything is hevel. And what he's saying is vapor. Vapor, says the preacher. Mist. Everything is mist. And so you can kind of understand why the translators would change that word, because it kind of makes sense, right? Like mist, one of the things that's true about vapor and mist is that it's here and then it's gone, right? And so it seems like its existence is meaningless, which is a mean thing to say to mist, but it doesn't hear you, so whatever. So here's the thing. You can see why they would translate it that way, because it makes sense. But if you translate it as meaningless or vanity, you run into some problems. And here's one of them. Here's a couple of them. In the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon says that good things are meaningless. He says justice is hevel. He says that righteousness is hevel. He says that following God and the fear of the Lord is hevel. And if you read the rest of the Bible, you're put in a conundrum, because you're like, either Solomon's a heretic or it doesn't mean meaningless. So in this kind of interpretation is now, it's changing in the commentaries. It's really interesting to watch how these things change. But anyway, here's the idea that I think makes way more sense. It's not that mist means meaningless, hevel means meaningless. It's that what Solomon's trying to connote or trying to tell us with this image is something different. It's that mist, vapor, it's a paradox. You know what a paradox is? It's when two things that can't be true are true. Two things that can't be true are true. One of the classic paradoxes of Christianity is that God is completely in control of everything. In Acts, it says he ordains the times and the places. That means everything happens because he made it happen. And at the same time, we also teach that we have free will. We choose to do things. And those two truths they don't make sense together. It's a paradox. They're both true, but it's hard to understand. So here's the thing. What Solomon is saying, one of the natures of vapor is that it's a paradox. So let me help you understand this, okay? Has anybody ever been in an intense, thick, solid fog? Anybody driven through a fog? I remember when I was in high school, I was at a summer camp, and this is like one of the weirdest weather phenomena I have ever experienced. There was a cloud. This was on Lake Michigan, the camp was, and there was a fog on the lake. and it was moving towards me. And I was up on a hill overlooking all of this, and I remember seeing this huge cloud like coming for me. It was like a Stephen King novel. And basically people start disappearing, and you're like, where'd they go? The fog had completely enveloped them, and then buildings, like whole buildings, they're gone. They disappeared. This cloud was so thick, it was so dense, it was so solid that you couldn't, when it hit me, I could barely see my fingertips. It was so crazy. Now, here's the thing. We use words like solid, dense, thick. We use words for fog that we know aren't true. If you took a high school chemistry class, you know that fog is a vapor. It's a gas. It's not solid. It's not dense. It's not thick. It's a gas. And yet at the same time, we perceive it as solid. So here's what Solomon is saying. Everything is hevel. It seems solid, and it's not solid. Sometimes things are good, and they're not good. And so here's the central image, what Solomon's trying to say, and he's going to talk about a lot of different things, and he's going to call them all hevel. What he's trying to communicate is that the world that we live in is a paradox. Sometimes it's solid, and sometimes it's not. Now, if you're confused, just keep following me because I think you're going to understand a little bit more as we continue. So I want to show you this. These are all the things that Solomon calls hevel. We're going to start the list here. So that's the central image. And as we kind of look at the hevelness of life, you're going to start to see why you should just give up, okay? Here we go. Yeah, it's a very fun one. Okay, Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 3. So the book opens, Solomon says, hevel, hevel, everything is hevel. And then he says, I know because I've tried it all. And here's the list of the things he tried. He says, I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in all of them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than anyone who had come before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the children of man. If you don't know what a concubine is, ask your mom. Sorry, moms. I'm not touching that. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me. Pleasure, I skipped one, my bad. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all of my toil, and this was my reward for all of my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was hevel, and a striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So here's what Solomon just said. I did all the things that you might think were pleasurable, all the things that you might think were fun. I did all the things. And at the end of it, I sat down and I considered my ways and I thought about my life. And what I realized is that it's hevel. It's hevel. Now, here's what you got to understand. Remember, it's a paradox. Hevel is a paradox. He's not saying that pleasure is bad, because especially if you read the Song of Solomon, he thinks it's good. But also in Ecclesiastes, he talks about how pleasure and joy and being pleased, that's a good thing. So he's not saying it's meaningless. He's not saying it's void, it's nothing. He's not saying that. What he's saying is that sometimes pleasure is good and sometimes pleasure is bad. So if you think about this, we have the capacity to feel pleased. I personally love feeling full, and Mexican food is my favorite way to get there. And it's just me, salsa for the win. That's a good, God created that feeling, and it's a pleasant feeling. It's a good thing. It's a gift that God has given us. So there is good things in pleasure. It is good to delight in your kids, to delight in your spouse, to delight in the things that God has given you. That's good. But we also know this, that sometimes pleasure is bad. We call pleasure in somebody else's pain, we call that malice. That's the wrong place to put pleasure, right? Sometimes we choose pleasure over work, and then that leads to, Solomon says in Proverbs, it leads to sorrow and starvation. Sometimes pleasure is good, but sometimes pleasure is bad. Solomon's saying this: when you think about pleasure in your life, don't chase it. Don't make it the only thing that you're living for. Why? Because pleasure is a paradox. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Sometimes it's solid, sometimes it's not. It's hevel. It's hevel. That's not the only thing that he tried, though. He continues. This is chapter 2, verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man who comes after the For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. He's like, I became king. There's a king before me. I'm bored, so I'm just going to consider wisdom. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will also happen to me. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart, this is also hevel. For of the wise as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come, all will have been long forgotten. This line is so poignant. He says, how the wise dies just like the fool. He says, even wisdom, which you might think is good, he says it's not good, it's hevel. It's hevel. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. His explicit argument is this: you can pile up all the wisdom and knowledge, you can read all the books, and then you're going to die. Where'd it go? It's gone. Have you ever, if you're a little older, you'll understand this. Have you ever been working on a project and saved it or thought you did? See, that's the feeling. Now everything auto-saves, which is great. But here's the thing. This is what Solomon is saying. You can work to fill up that flash drive with all of your projects, but if you lose that flash drive, who cares? You can fill your mind with the most beautiful thoughts about how the world works, but when you die, it's gone. And he says this, what happens to the fool also happens to the wise. Death is the great equalizer. So he says this: wisdom is hevel. He's not saying it's bad. He's not saying it's meaningless. He's saying that sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. We can all understand how wisdom would be good, especially if you're with us for the Proverbs series. That makes sense, right? But have you met somebody who knows more than you, and they know that they know more than you, and you feel a little bit dumb, but they know that you feel dumb, and they're kind of agreeing with you? Have you ever had that moment? Not just me, thank God. Sometimes it's good to have wisdom and knowledge. Sometimes it's bad. Sometimes you can hurt people. Did you, maybe in high school or in college, you knew the kid or the person who spent all of their time studying and getting A's and working super, super hard and only to get second? They didn't get the first, they got second. And then they finished high school in second place and with no friends. Sometimes wisdom is good. Sometimes it's not good. Sometimes it's solid. Sometimes it's not solid. Sometimes you can count on it, and there are times when it will let you down. It's hevel. It's not meaningless, and it's not perfect, but it is hevel. That's wisdom. He continues, and he says this: what has a man from all the toil and striving of his heart with which he toils beneath the sun? I love that phrase, striving of the heart with which he toils. There's a difference between people who refer to what they do for a living as their job, and then there's people who refer to what they do for a living as their career. You know what I mean? There's people who are like, ugh, gotta go to work. And then there's people who are like, yes, work. Here we go, and they're like, wow, you have way too much energy for the morning. Calm down, you're making me angry. Anyway, it's kind of like, there are people who have their heart in their job. Their heart, it's not just that their body is striving, it's also that their heart is striving. Here's the thing, Solomon's not saying that that's bad, right? He's saying it's hevel. It's not meaningless, it's not evil, it's not bad, it's just hevel. If you read the Proverbs, there's a lot that Solomon talks about the sluggard or the sloth, which is the lazy person. And basically, the message that he's trying to send is that you should work. That's a good thing. And you should want to work, because that also is a good thing. Because you're going to end up sorrowful or sad. You're going to end up angry that you didn't work before. You're going to regret it. Solomon views work as a good thing. But work can also be a bad thing. You've probably seen, this is a common character in kids' movies. It's the dad who's always on the cell phone, and the kid's like, oh, I want to spend time with you. And the dad's like, oh, I got to work, blah, blah, blah. You've seen that, right? Solomon's not the only person to have ever said this, right? We understand this. Here's what Solomon says about work. I love this. For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. I'll explain vexation. That Hebrew word means anger or grief. And so here's what Solomon is saying. And his work it only causes him angry, it only makes him angry, or it only makes him sad. I think we've all been there, right? Man, that's how work feels sometimes. It says, it's hevel. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This is also hevel. He's saying, don't place all of your eggs in the work basket. Don't chase your career only, because at the end of the day, here's what you're going to realize. I worked so hard, and it only made me frustrated, and it only made me sad, and at the end of the day, I didn't get anything. It's hevel. It's vanity. But that's not the only thing that he says is hevel. He continues, and this is the shocker. This is the big one here. He says, there is a vanity that takes place on the earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this is also vanity. He continues, but all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man doesn't know. Both are before God. It is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and to the wicked, to the good and to the evil, to the clean and to the unclean, to him who makes sacrifices and to him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner, and he who swears is as he who shuns an oath. He says, this is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that the same event happens to all. You have to see this. Here's what he's saying. Righteousness, justice, goodness, the fear of the Lord, it's hevel. And here's what he means by that. It's really hard for us to understand how this could be solid and not solid, how it could be good and not good. But let me explain, because we all assume that fearing the Lord and doing righteousness and working justice, we all assume that that's good. In the last 20 years or so, it's really kind of been a huge event in the church in America. And that's basically is that we've realized that for the previous 20 years or whatever, we had a religion, a Christianity, that valued the outer appearance instead of the inward heart. We valued a Christianity that said, do the right thing, and it doesn't matter if you love Jesus, it doesn't matter if you want him, it doesn't even matter if you follow him during the week, you just have to do the right thing when it matters. And so what happens is we had churches in which there was a dress code that's not in the Bible, it's just the dress code, and if you don't live up to the dress code, well then, we're going to call into question your purity. That's kind of like how it goes. And Christianity became all about the rules and all about righteousness, and it produced a generation who hates the church. And the reason for that is that the kids who grew up in that said, I know you. You act that way on Sunday. You don't act that way when you're at home. Righteousness is solid, and there's sometimes when it's not solid. It's good, and there's sometimes when it produces evil. We see this in the Pharisees is the best example. They had righteousness, but Jesus said, you are like a whitewashed tomb. You look good on the outside, you're dead on the inside. So Solomon says, hevel, all is hevel. Here's basically what I'm trying to show you that he's saying. He's saying, just give up. Quit pursuing these things. Don't think for 1 second that wealth, wisdom, might, power, looking good, being accepted by other people, don't think for 1 second that those things are good, because they're not good, they're hevel. Sometimes they're solid, and sometimes they're not. And if you chase those things and think of those things as supreme, as the highest good that you can attain, if that's how you see the world, your life is going to look high when it's good, and it's going to be really low when it's bad. Nothing's 100% good. And so if you chase wealth, you're going to be really high when you got a savings account, and then you're going to have to spend money on your car. That's what happens to savings accounts. Anyway, if you chase people like people thinking well of you, it's going to be really high when they're like, "Good job at work, bro. You did that project was really, really good." And then your boss is going to be like, "Well, I had one criticism," and you're just going to be like, and paralyzed, right? Some of you do that inside. I just did it outside, and you recognize that. Anyway, here's the thing: if you think that any of these things are 100% good, you missed it. It's hevel. It's hevel. It's not 100% good. So let's think about this. Pleasure might be 50% good, right? Like sometimes it's good to have delight and pleasure in the things that God has given you. David in Psalm 4 says, you have given me, I think the word is delight, more delight than when their grain and wine abound. And he's praising God because of the delight and the pleasure in his soul. Sometimes pleasure is good, but sometimes it just lets you down, right? And so here's the thing, this is what Psalm is saying, is, man, just give up. Quit chasing those things as the only thing that you're chasing. Just give up. But once you've given up, he has some advice. Here's what you should do. And I love this. I'm going to read, this is such a common thought in the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm going to just read a lot of scripture, okay? And I want you to see if you can guess. Once you just give up, guess what Solomon thinks that you should do. Here's what he says. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also, I saw, is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to another who pleases God. This also is a vanity and a striving after the wind. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and to rejoice in his toil, this is a gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the joy in his heart. And I commend joy, for man has no good thing under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. Go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved of what you do. Let your garments always be white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. These are symbols of joy and happiness. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life. I love how he snuck that one in. Of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life. And in your toil at which you toil under the sun, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol or the grave to which you are going. Solomon says, once you just give up seeking these things for your self-worth, for your well-being, for how your life is going, as like a litmus test, if I'm good or worthy or not, once you give up, what you should do is eat, drink, and be happy. Find joy in the things. Because here's the thing, life is hevel, remember? Sometimes it's solid, sometimes it's not. Sometimes wisdom is good and sometimes it's not. Solomon is saying, find joy when it's good, find joy when it's bad. Don't make wisdom the joy. Be joyful when there's pleasure, be joyful when there's not pleasure. Don't make pleasure the joy. Find joy in the career when it's going well, and when it's not going well, find joy. Joy is everywhere. You have just got to find it. Solomon's basically saying, accept that life is hevel and just be happy where you're at. So kind of the heart of the book of Ecclesiastes is this famous passage that I'm sure you've heard that I think ties it all together. This is Ecclesiastes 3. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. He says this after that verse, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Solomon is saying there is beauty in every moment, whether it's a good one or a bad one, whether it's positive and a joyful moment and a rejoicing moment or a sorrowful, sad moment. There is beauty in everything. Why? Because God has made it beautiful in its time. And when you can learn to stop and look for that beauty, you'll see it. I used to work in a nursing home, and there were times that were very sad, right? Because people pass away in a nursing home. One of the things that the nurses and the nurses' aides who worked there would kind of talk about is that in those moments when the father, the patriarch of the family dies, and the daughter who wasn't talking to the son, and the son who hated the mother, and the grandson who got away from the family, they all come together at the bed, and they all cry over the same thing. There is beauty even in the worst moments. There are good things. You just have to look. I think we know this, right? Has anybody ever seen the movie A Muppet's Christmas Carol? That's it. Muppet's Christmas Carol? Yep, come on. Kermit and his little Kermit son, Timmy, or whatever. Anyway, I don't know. Like we have these stories in which a character, Scrooge, has been miserly his whole life. You know, he has zero joy. He does not like people. He does not like things. He only wants to make money. That's his only thing that he loves. It's his highest value. And he has chased it at the expense of having everything else in life. All he has is money. And then he visits, ghosts visit him. And then he has a change of heart. And then he shares his money with everybody else. Like we have these stories in our culture. Like, this is wisdom from Solomon, but Solomon's not the only one to realize that we're to find the beauty and joy in the small things, and that's the secret to life. We all know this, but none of us do it. And here's why I think that happens. We're too busy. Solomon over and over in Ecclesiastes says this, I stopped and I considered my ways. I stopped and I pondered what I'd been doing. I stopped and I thought about the way I've been living my life. I stopped and I thought and I pondered and I meditated on what I had been doing. I stopped and I thought. There's a pastor in, I think, Chicago named John Ortberg, and he says this. He says that hurry is the enemy of the soul. Hurry is the enemy of the soul, and here's why. If you live a hurried life, you will go through life chasing whatever. You'll chase wealth or security or popularity, fame, success. You'll chase anything, and you won't stop to think, am I chasing the right thing? And at the end of your life, you'll realize that was all for nothing. I thought it was good, but it's good sometimes, and it's not good other times. It's solid, but it's not solid. It's hevel. And Solomon basically says the secret to life is to stop and find the beauty in all the things. I'm going to bring the band up, but as they come up, I want to read to you the last verse in Ecclesiastes. Actually, it's the second to last one. It says this. This is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Solomon, the author of Ecclesiastes, basically says this, realize, accept it. Just give up. Realize and accept that all of life is hevel. It's mist, it's vapor, it's solid and it's not solid. Sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. It's good in its season, sometimes it's hard in a different season. Accept that truth and look for the little beauties in every moment. I shared a little bit about like how death can sometimes be beautiful. You can see some beauty in the passing away of somebody. But here's the truth. Like, we don't have to come up with like a clever like way to find the beauty in every single moment. We don't have to do that because we have a God who dwells inside of us. If you remember the very first message in this series, we talked about how God created out of a bubbling up, out of an overflow of joy and love and peace and patience and kindness. The Father is constantly loving the Son, who's loving the Spirit, who's loving the Father, who's loving the Son, who's loving the Spirit, and they're passing this joy around. And at some point, it bubbled up and overflowed, and God spoke, and the world came into existence. That same God dwells inside of you. And maybe what you have to hear in the middle of this winter season, like maybe what you have to hear in the middle of whatever season of life that you're in, you have to hear this, that joy is possible. Joy is possible because of the God of the universe dwelling inside of you. Joy is possible. You just have to stop and look for it. And I believe that he'll reveal that to you. Will you stand?